Hey all, welcome back to Mike Reads the World, where today I'll be discussing The Wizard of the Crow by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, a fascinating Kenyan author with a fascinating life. The short version is he was a activist in Kenya against the dictatorship in the 60s and 70s, was put into prison where he wrote a novel on scraps of toilet paper, and then had to go into exile to abroad, and he's taught at universities in the United States, and has written, since his exile, he has written all his books in his native Kenyan language. So it's very rare that we get an African writer, anytime in the last 100 years writing in a native language. He translated at least The Wizard of the Crow himself to English. So it almost kind of begs the question, like, is this a translation or is it a rewritten novel in English? Because clearly he's fluent in English. So and obviously there is a distinction, but it's just kind of an interesting question to think about that distinction, because the more I've thought about it lately, there are very few books written in English, even the classics, that I truly love. I really can hardly name any. I love translated literature. The act of translation almost seems to add a level of sincere communication and another layer of trying to understand an author's meaning and intent. And in fact, somebody translating another work is really almost adding to it, adding another layer of thought and interpretation to it. And just thinking about that, there's kind of a new appreciation for translators. Of course, I've been appreciating them throughout this project, not as much as I should be. Sometimes I even forget to name them, which is really a gross error on my part. But it's a hard sell, though. This book is a hard sell because 300 pages in, I still wasn't even sure if I was going to like it, let alone love it. By the end, I'm certain it's a book that I'm going to read again. It's left me with so many questions. It's really kind of turned the whole way I see sub-Saharan African literature around in a different way. And it's tough because I know if you're like me, you want to read the best stuff, and you have limited time in life, and you're like, and we have the power these days to create our curated personal collections of amazing books written throughout history, and why should you read this one? Well, I think this Pan-African approach that he's taken, and it really is, it's a fictional African country of Aburiria, the Free Republic of Aburiria, with a fictional dictator, right? And people have tried this sort of thing before, but after having read quite a few books that have attempted something like this and given up on them, this one pulled me along to the end, even when I wasn't sure about it. I had every reason, everything in my brain was telling me I'm not going to like this, and I didn't even listen to this opening epitaph. Is that what you call it? This intro to the book. Listen, in the spirit of the dead, the living and the unborn, empty your ears of all impurities, O listener, that you may hear my story. We must come to this book as listeners, not with Western conceptions of what is great literature, not, and it's hard to do because we all do this. I did it. And I think there's probably a lot of people, I don't know who this book is for. There's a lot of people that are going to give up halfway through. There's a lot of people that will finish it and say, that was okay. I feel like that was 760 pages, not well spent. I do feel that that's the case. And yet I look at the tradition of sub-Saharan African literature, and I'm intentionally using that reductive sort of wide-spanning region, because today and in this book we are looking at commonalities in that whole region. And one of those is the tradition of oral storytelling and oral epics. Now, we have like Kamar Lay, writing his version of the Sundiata, the Guardian of the Word. Geez, I don't even know what I did with it. I just had it here. We have the Epic of Askia Mohammed here. Yeah, here we go. We have oral folktales like from Benin and from Chad. And we've looked at all these different things that are based in the oral tradition of sub-Saharan Africa in my Read Around the World project. And you have to understand, like, that is the root. And they don't always translate very well to written books, not in the most interesting or the way that we've come to expect their construction. And so I'm trying to approach this book with this mentality of every tradition of literature has its own aesthetic standards and its own aesthetic approach. And even, once you get into the later stuff, even the great Shaka by Thomas Mafolo, written in the 1920s, which is like, it takes the story of Shaka Zulu basically to epic proportions, and definitely you can feel the oral tradition alive and well in that book and the way it tells stories within the stories and things. But as we get farther along in the 40s and 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, in sub-Saharan African literature, we find like this continual conflict with the Western literary tradition that seems inextractable. And it's not always the most pleasant thing to read. It does feel, for lack of a better word, oppressive to read, especially when you can feel the author, these glimpses of this beautiful tradition kind of poking their heads out of this rigid sort of imposed Western literary structure on the writing. I don't know how well of a job I'm doing at explaining this, but I feel it's very important as a preface to a book like this, because I feel that this book is in complete conflict with that sort of not only the Western literary tradition, but the Western standards of government, economy. We come up against all that stuff. Basically, how does the West view this Pan-African nation, this nation that could be any nation in Africa? It is not just a representation of Kenya. In fact, Kenya is even pointedly named at one time in the book to tell us that this country is not Kenya or Tanzania. I think it's Kenya and Tanzania at both names. And so it really is aiming to be Pan-African, this nation of Aboriria. So let's kind of get into what the book is about, right? So the book opens almost as a mystery of why is the ruler falling ill. There are many theories about the strange illness of the second ruler of the Free Republic of Aboriria, but the most frequent on people's lips were 5. And so it goes through the 5 theories about why this ruler fell ill. And then we also have the book divided into 6 parts. Okay, we have, and they are all named after demons with an A. So Daemons, specifically separating it from Satan, right? And hell and the Christian religion. We are talking about spirits or objects of power. They are power demons, queuing demons, female demons, male demons, rebel demons, and bearded demons. And each one of these sections somewhat corresponds to one of these theories about why the ruler has fallen ill. But there's a number of interconnected things going on in this book. Even though you only have about 10 characters, it is an incredibly complex book to explain to somebody, because all of these characters create they have their own misunderstandings about the world. They create deceptions for others, and all of these misunderstandings and deceptions influence every other character and events going on around them, which all in turn continue to snowball and affect everything that happens. It is almost like nobody's intention in this book leads to a direct result. Never, ever once. And it's not quite magical realism. There is like 2 or 3 maybe magical things you could call that happen in the book, potentially. And it's what it really is just absurd. It is absurdism. An absurdist realism or a realist absurdism. I'm not sure what to call it. Almost bordering on allegory. I think it is closer to allegory than it is to magical or fantastical. Personally, every single character is representative, and even one of the first quotes or the first things I noted here is that early in the book, it is mentioned that the ruler has jailed a historian for writing a book called "The People Make History, Then a Ruler Makes It His Story." What a great title for a book, huh? And I think that tells us something about this entire book, that the ruler of this fictional country is co-opting the story of his people. He is an empty shell. He has no story. And pretty early on, we start to realize that the main conflicts of this book are 2. We have the ruler himself and his cabinet, and the ministers of his cabinet, the 2 main ones, as well as 2 other sort of up and coming people from society with important positions. One, a businessman who is kind of in charge of the economic side of things, and then you have one who is sort of like a spy. He's sort of this espionage type of guy. These two guys plus these 2 ministers are all kind of going to start going at it, trying to win influence and power through the ruler's favor, and they use all kinds of underhanded means to try to sabotage each other. And the other main conflict is from above, right? So the other main conflict is from below. You have this movement of the people, which appears to be led mainly by women, and you have the Wizard of the Crow himself, who is kind of a man of strange origins. Even though there is sort of a backstory to him. He starts the book out as wandering around the city with a duffel bag, and he has 2 uniforms, 2 suits that he puts on. One is a business suit, that's him looking for a job. Another is a bunch of rags so that he can beg for money. And throughout the novel, he continues to sort of alternate between the business suit of trying to be a proper man of society and his rags. So you have this conflict at the bottom, basically, of these people trying to uprise against the ruler. But meanwhile, the people of the country are forming queues. And the word here is, queues, almost, which we don't really use in the United States too much, but essentially just forming lines for everything. And these lines are endless. People just keep joining the lines, and they go round and round squares, and as soon as people leave, other people join. And so this queuing process is obviously symbolic. All of this stuff is obviously symbolic. It's so hard to summarize this book. It is so hard to summarize this book, but just giving this as an intro, I think the best way I can say it is that tall tales influence and become reality from below. Lies and deception do the same from above, but this entire book is people acting based on misunderstanding. Nobody is really understanding the truth of what's going on. They are all making decisions and actions that are influencing everybody else, and the misunderstandings and the lies and the deceit from the ministers, the ruler, the Wizard of the Crow himself start to compound. How does he even become the Wizard of the Crow? It's almost completely by accident. He is running from a police officer with the woman who is the leader of the movement of the people, and he adopts this disguise in order to escape from this policeman. Well, this policeman becomes the tale teller, telling the tale of the Wizard of the Crow, which spreads. And then people start coming to him as the Wizard of the Crow, believing his disguise is real, and he starts acting it, and so becomes what he is pretending to be almost in reality. And he starts actually healing people and finding he's good at it, and this woman he's with helps him do it. So both of them in reality are the Wizard of the Crow. They take turns, and it's this idea of the double, which you find actually in a lot of the African literature, is this idea of like a person has sort of a double as well. And that's the other main symbol of the novel, I think, is well, there's so many, but the mirror. The Wizard of the Crow, both of them, use a mirror to divine sort of what, and to diagnose and to understand their patient, and then prescribe a treatment. And it seems the man who becomes the Wizard of the Crow is actually Kamiti is his name, is actually predicting a lot of things that come to pass or influencing them. We don't really know, or it's just chance. So, and then there's the Tower of Babel. The ruler wants to build a Tower of Babel, and the Global Bank, not the World Bank, the Global Bank, is the entity responsible for basically assessing and providing any funds for any projects to this country. And so the ruler, what he wants to do is build a tower to heaven. Marching to heaven, I believe, is how he describes it. But he wants to build a modern day Tower of Babel. An infinite project, essentially, that's going to employ, maybe the whole country to building this tower to the heavens. And however, as we go on, we're gonna see how the Global Bank reacts to this. You can maybe imagine that they might not be so willing just to pour infinite funds into a corrupt and dictatorial ruler's project. But all of the hypocrisy around that comes out later in the book as well. There is absolutely so much to discuss in this book. I have actually never been so at a loss of where to start, where to enter this. Now, there are quite a few funny moments in the book as well. There's sort of this part where the Wizard of the Crow is confronted with, why is he wearing a suit? Like, are you a postmodern witch doctor? And he goes, no, I'm a post-colonial witch doctor. And I thought it was funny. And then there's references to other literature, like Tsitsi Dangaramba's Nervous Conditions, which by the woman who is the leader of the People's Movement, says to the Wizard of the Crow, it's like, you got to read more African women, and mentions a bunch of books, and that's one of them. Oops, sorry if I grabbed the mic there. And then there's references to the Mahabharata, Ramayana, Bhagavad Gita. There's kind of a funny reference to Descartes, where there's a total misunderstanding about Descartes and Doubting Thomas, and how it relates Descartes to Doubting Thomas, just from the misunderstanding of the character, thinking that this is some kind of religion of doubt, that you should never trust anybody. Kind of hard to explain a lot of the humor in this book. You had to be there kind of thing, right? but it is in there. And there's there's a part where somebody holds up an entire prison with a bucket of his own poop, who he says, that he says is diseased. I guess I I don't know if I'm spoiling this book. I don't know how you spoil this book, really. I'm trying not to like give away the entire ending, but or the entirety of what happens. But it's just like it's another one of those books where all that you get out of it is in the details. And again, it's a really hard sell. I don't know if there's like a lot of people who are. I just feel that this book really stands out in all of the African literature that I've read, is one that is the most complete of all its themes. That's really trying to synthesize like all of what's been lost and smashing it against all of the things that made us lose it. The expectations of Western tradition, the sort of the domination of it in these countries. And it's just, this book itself is kind of an act of resistance against that, the way it's written. And I feel that in its writing, and especially in the character of A.G., the policeman who is telling stories about the Wizard of the Crow. Every time he starts telling his stories about the Wizard of the Crow, I find myself cheering him on and saying, yeah, and the Wizard of the Crow is kind of like, is somehow representative of the culture itself, I think. And as we get later on in the book, there's just too much to talk about. It's one of those books. But I do want to share my favorite, at least the part of the book that I think is going to stay with me forever, for the rest of my life, because it is such a simple and good folktale dropped at the perfect time. Machokali, the eyes of the president, is with the ruler in his room in America as the ruler is sick, and then the policeman who's been telling all these stories, Arigaigai Gathiri, or alias AG, the one who tells the stories of the Wizard of the Crow throughout the entire book to all the people of the country, he comes over and says to the eyes of the president, I really don't know where or how to start, but I want to begin by begging you not to take lightly what an underling like me. Do you know the story of the elephant and the thorn? Please spare me the wisdom of folk tales, Machokali said, forcing himself to laugh as if he'd been joking, but in his heart he was burning with anxiety, for another thought had crept into his mind. Had Sikioku seized power? That's the ears of the president. He's in this sort of, they're fighting over things. Let me tell you the story all the same. Elephant felt something sharp in his foot, and when he removed it and saw that it was a tiny thorn, he was very angry. How can such a tiny thing prevent a big animal like me from walking? He pushed the thorn back into his foot and walked on, stamping the ground with defiance. The infection that later developed in the foot killed Elephant. Hence the saying, never look down upon the small. True! Haki Yamungu, I too ask you, don't despise the messenger, however lowly, or take lightly the message, however strange. I think this is another time when the book, in a sort of meta way, through one of the little folk tales delivered by the main teller of tall tales himself in the book, is dropped at the perfect time, and that metaphor of the thorn in the elephant's foot and the elephant obstinately pushing it back into his foot and walking upon it just to prove a point and then dying of fever is an excellent metaphor for many things in life beyond even what this book is saying. And I think revealed to me sort of the power of those simple folk tales that I still find the tale that I was told when I was young, the very first tale I ever remember from my childhood, or the most important one, was that tale of the blind men that all feel a different part of the elephant. It's always something to do with an elephant, right? One thinks it's the trunk is the snake, one thinks thinks the foot it's a tree, right? And they all think it's something different, but only by putting their perspectives together do they see the reality. So again, I'm saying I never like to essentialize a book or say, you know, you have to read this book. It's an unmissable book, but I've made the mistake of dismissing, I think, perhaps some modern work somewhere that had a lot to tell me. But I'm grateful that I did not dismiss The Wizard of the Crow. And it's one that I'm going to go back into many times. I'm going to reread. I'm going to continue to try to look up online other people's discussions about it. I'm very fascinated with this book and the way that the global bank is portrayed in this project of marching to heaven that the ruler has, where he wants to employ basically his entire country and get unlimited loans from the global bank to build his Tower of Babel to the heavens. And as people are lining up and queuing to try to find jobs, to get a job doing this, he sends out, he and his ministers send out riders, five riders, not the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, it says, but 5 to the corners and the center of the country to spread the word and get people in lines, get people queuing, until this queuing becomes a rebellion and he says, no, we have to stop this, but then forgets that he even sent these riders out to raise up the people's spirits, and they will come back later in the book in a very funny way that I don't want to spoil, but it's this interconnection of all the parts in the book, and you can't quite make out any truth. No character can ever grasp the truth, the full truth of what's happening. They are caught in these webs of lies and deceptions and myths and folk tales and beliefs in the supernatural and witch doctors and all this stuff, but it all is part of Aburiria, the country of this book. It is all the Pan-African symbols. They're making up this pantheon of Pan-African symbols, and the mirror to me that the Wizard of the Crow uses is a very powerful symbol, especially when he uses it to confront the ministers with their own ambition. Another very important scene in the book. And revealing sort of the underlying psychology of the seeking of power, and here in these 10 main characters or so, I think is somehow hidden a complete view of the Pan-African problem. At least I think that was the author's intention. I don't know if he completely achieved it. I don't know if Ngugi wa Thiong'o really managed to capture all of the complexities. Can you in a allegory like this? But in all of this twisted web of deceit and myth, did he find a truth? A kind of truth? I guess that's the question I'm left asking here. Among the demons and and towards the end of the book, the global bank is, it sometimes gets really on the nose, but I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary because, again, we have here a confrontation of things that aren't necessarily poetic, but they do shape the world. Like the envoy from the global bank, or is it the United States, speaking to the ruler saying, the West and the civilized world are eternally grateful to you for your role in our victory over the evil empire. Talking about how this president crushed the communists, right? And then he goes on to say, we are in a post-Cold War era, and our calculations are affected by the laws and needs of globalization. The history of capital can be summed up in one phrase: in search of freedom. Freedom to expand, and now it has a chance at the entire globe for its theater. It needs a democratic space to move its own logic demands. And this comes as they're telling this ruler he can no longer shoot his own people and that he should move toward a democracy. And so they move toward a democracy, but in the most oppressive way imaginable. Basically, the ruler is still in charge of all the parties, and whoever gets elected will still be under him, and it's a complete farce. And this is a perfect example of how this book, I don't know how this book does this. It rides the entire time this line between being so cliche. I feel like at so many points in this book I thought, okay, now it's going to get really cliche and I really am not going to like it anymore, and just, you know, why am I reading these 760 pages? But it always just takes a slightly different turn than I expect. Okay, so I almost wonder if I've given away too much in talking about some of the details of it, but I'm really grappling even within myself of why I feel this book was worth reading, why it was good, or is it just me saying, well, you know, it's that sort of retroactive, well, I spent a week of my life reading this, so I damn well better find some meaning in it, you know? It could be that too. It could be that too, but I feel that I will stand up for this book as if you know, you want to get into African literature, and especially you know, if you want to read something by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I personally have not you know, been as convinced to read any of his other books as this one, and but now I want to. I want to read some of his other books because actually, The Devil on the Cross is mentioned within this book. One of his books is mentioned within this book as somebody reading it. So he does that sort of thing, the old Cervantes trick. But, you know, it's I actually think there are a lot of references to his other books in this book. There's even the phrase "a grain of wheat" appears. And I think everything that he was struggling with throughout his career as a writer, you know, his days as an activist, his time in prison, I think he has synthesized and put all of it into this book, and really that this was his ultimate drive at creating the most powerful allegory he possibly could for the current Pan-African situation, or at least at 2006 when he was writing it. But we shouldn't be so quick in the United States to dismiss the lessons that this book might be showing us for ourselves, because I more and more feel that the term developing nation is going the way of the terms third world country and second world country. In other words, a meaningless phrase, because how many countries throughout the world are we seeing that have seen, you know, 10 to 20 years of constant economic growth? You know, look at Peru's a great example. I don't know, maybe there's others, but that's the one I am most familiar with. And so I look at that situation and say, there's been economic growth for 20 years, more than 20 years, and yet so little actual lasting development. People have more money. People have more purchasing power. You know, basic survival needs are met. I'm not saying we're better off, you know, with an economy that's crashing and people starving and stuff. I'm not saying that that's better at all, right? But what I am saying is that we could have done so much better in so many countries, right? And I mean, we collectively as a human, and in the United States too, we have wasted so much money in this country in our entire history. I mean, if you really start examining it. And so it's just, and resources, not just the money, but the resources attached to them, right? And there's even a part in this book that kind of examines this sort of, how does money create money? And that there's a myth of a money tree, money that starts growing on trees at one point. So even that's a symbol in here. The more I could keep talking about this book for an hour and themes around it, and I would start to keep remembering how almost everything that I could possibly talk about connects to something in this book about politics or society, or, you know, even my own country. And so we shouldn't be quick to dismiss these, because the idea of developing nations we're seeing economic growth, but not development. You know, not only in other nations, but in the United States. You know, the inflation increasing and stuff. And so it's like, if we're not developing, if we're not creating a sustainable future, it's not development. It's not sustainable. It's by the definition. That was a totally redundant phrase, right? And so we need to see too these nations that we would once call developing nations or nations that are third world or whatever as our potential future, because this can't last forever. And you know, democracy, representational democracy, to me it seems is an exception rather than a rule in the entirety of human history. And the abolition of slavery has been an exception rather than a rule in what we know of human history. And so the progress that we've made in certain areas is, in the long run, tenuous at best. And what do we want for our children, our grandchildren? What is progress? It makes you ask all those questions. What can we do? Is it inevitable? No, I mean, you know, we don't stop trying to make things better, at least for the next generation, right? So these are all things that I found myself confronted with while reading The Wizard of the Crow. Just kind of a ramble, I guess, but that's part of the point of reading too. You know, it's not just to, as I've said in other videos, to relate to people in the past, although that's a huge part of it. It's not quite moral instruction, but, you know, there's nothing wrong with taking lessons out of books and about how to think about the world around you and what could we do about it? You know, what could we do about it? And it's often been books from this particular region, Sub-Saharan Africa, that cause me the most cognitive dissonance, that cause me the most difficulty, because they confront me with difficult questions. And that is highly valuable in itself, because it is so easy to get lost in the weeds of nonsense everywhere. But you know, this book is full of nonsense that makes huge impacts on a country, on the world. And when you realize that these are symbols, that these are massive symbols of real life things, the characters themselves must represent the people. You know, they have to represent something powerful about different factions or different groups of people that this author has experienced in his life, I would imagine. So, a very clumsy review. I feel this is one of the most clumsiest and difficult reviews or talks, whatever you want to call it, I've ever done. Just a very difficult book to grapple with in so many ways. I don't think the next one is going to be as difficult, but it's going to be in the shadow of this one. And it was a book I wanted so much to dismiss. I mean, part of me wanted so much to dismiss it, to avoid these questions and to say, well, it's just not a great aesthetic achievement of world literature, and so I can bypass it. But I was not able to do that. It was compelling. It was compelling, and I kept going until the end. And I find myself completely unable to articulate why anyone else should read it, but I feel it was valuable to me. So that's what I gotta say about it. Yeah. All right. Thank you for watching this overblown review. Overblown like what happens in the illness of the ruler in this book. He starts swelling up. But he's an empty shell. And we see that, you know, that's the one last thing I wanted to say, because in my mind I could kind of compare this book to the Paraguayan author Augusto Roa Bastos, his Yo El Supremo. And I was thinking the Latin American dictator novel gives the dictator an excess of personality, like he's almost larger than life and has more person about him than anybody else. And Yo El Supremo was a real, like the vocabulary and the size of the book really matched that personality. I feel like Wizard of the Crow does something exactly similar, like reflecting what happens to the ruler. It's overbloated intentionally, and it works, This could have been a much, much shorter book. A much, much shorter book. Okay, this could have been 200 pages or less. It is intentionally overbloated, I think, but I also think I might be wrong in saying it's overbloated. I think there's a lot more in it than meets the initial read. I think it's worth a reread, but I wanted to say that, like Glory and The Parachute Drop, which are also African dictator novels, Wizard of the Crow is situated, published right in between them, pretty much. You got like 1980s, very recent, and 2006. So, you get a nice span between these. But all of the dictators in these books are like empty shells. They are personality-less. It's like they could be anybody. That no matter who's in that position, it's just, a man going, if. And I think that's noteworthy. So I'll leave you with that. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.